Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here with a new video, and welcome to episode 5 of the Underdogs of Raiding. I set up a poll a while ago to let you guys decide which spec was going to be featured next, and as it turns out, a lot of people wanted to see the Enhancement Shaman in the next episode. So, as promised, we're going to have a look at the Enhancement Shaman in this episode of the Underdogs of Raiding. So without further ado, let's go back in time to 2004. In the early days of vanilla, this was the talent tree shamans had, and if you look closely you can see that the enhancement tree is quite different from what we know when playing on a vanilla private server in today's world. There's individual talents to buff each weapon enchant, and the last tier of talents is Storm Strike and a talent to increase the agility of Grace of Air Totem. I know, quite different. Another thing worth noting is that the 3% hit talent Nature's Guidance wasn't in the game yet. So after you were done picking talents in the enhancement tree, you most of the time went straight to the elemental tree to boost your shock damage. Of course, the main thing we have to talk about is Wind Fury, because in vanilla, the enhancement shaman was all about that Wind Fury. So how did it work back then? Well, it's simple. Each melee attack you did had a 20% chance to trigger 2 extra attacks with bonus attack power. That's right, it was 20%. Which meant that theoretically speaking, you'd only get 1 Wind Fury proc from 5 melee attacks, and you had to be extra lucky to get a critical strike on one of those 2 extra hits. I know people think enhancement shamans were overpowered back then, and they were, when Wind Fury procced. I mean, let's face it, we've all seen Unbreakable's video of him doing insane Wind Fury crits, and he inspired many people to either respec to enhancement or make a brand new shaman character altogether. And to be fair, Unbreakable will live on as an absolute legend in the WoW community, and rightfully so. But the crits you see in those videos are definitely the exception. Like I said, Wind Fury procced once every 5 attacks, and getting crits on those extra attacks was even more rare. So while some hits were like this, most of them, unfortunately, were like this. Or this. Or this one. I think you get the point. This meant that playing an enhancement shaman with a big two-hander was a total roll of the dice. You either did a shitload of damage in less than a second, or you barely did any damage at all. So given that they were such an RNG class, how did things fare for the enhancement shaman in the early stages of vanilla WoW? Well, not too great. Sure, they were very popular in PvP, and if luck was on your side, you could have a lot of fun with this spec. But enhancement shamans were unfortunately excluded from raids. They had to go resto, as that Manatite totem was just too crucial to skip. Then we arrive at the later stage of vanilla. This was the talent tree shamans now had, and as you can see, the individual weapon buffs were replaced by talents who gave multiple weapon buffs from just single talents, though the one everyone still rolled with was Wind Fury, obviously. The improved Grace of Air talent was removed, and shamans now had the Nature's Guidance talents. Once again, I can't stress enough how important this was in vanilla, as gear with plus hit was very scarce, so any talents that gave you extra hit came in very handy. So how did things fare for the enhancement shaman in this stage of the game? Well, unfortunately, enhancement shamans were still looked down upon, though on today's private servers, enhancement shamans get a little bit more wiggle room when it comes to doing raids. You see, there is a place for enhancement shaman in raids, though it's not for their excellent DPS, because, well, it wasn't exactly great. They were mostly brought in to provide Wind Fury for a melee group and to apply a buff that would prove very handy for casters. See, the best in slot weapon for enhancement shaman whose main goal was to support a raid was Nightfall. A two-handed axe that has a chance on hit to increase the target spell damage taken by 15% for 5 seconds. Sure, that 5 seconds is not exactly a long period of time to do extra damage, and at best that would be 2 Frostbolts or 2 Shadow Bolts, but multiply that by the amount of mages and warlocks you have in your raid, and then multiply it by the amount of times it would proc during one boss fight, and you have yourself one very handy damage booster. So yeah, enhancement shamans did have their place in raids, though only for their buffs, and most of the time it was just one enhancement who was invited. Everyone else had to go resto almost all of the time. The later stage of Vanilla proved to be a bit more forgiving to the Enhancement Shaman. They were still strong in PvP, and at least a handful of Enhancement Shamans got to do some raiding, though their own damage was still lacking a bit, and that big two-hander was kind of in the way of them doing stable and reliable DPS. But those problems will be addressed soon enough. Time to move on to the Burning Crusade. The Burning Crusade was a very important expansion for the Enhancement Shaman. Like I explained earlier, Enhancement Shamans were relying heavily on RNG as their main way to do damage was with a big two-hander, so their damage was all over the place. Luckily, in the Burning Crusade, the talent tree was revamped into this one right here. And what do you know? Shamans got dual wield. This meant that I had a much higher chance of proccing Wind Fury and thus a much more stable damage output. I also explained in my Elemental Shaman video how Shamans were the king of buffing, and Enhancement Shamans were no exception. One of the most important totems for an Enhancement Shaman when raiding was probably their Wind Fury totem, which gave everyone else in their group the same weapon enchantment that they had. Though the other players got one attack off of this, not two attacks like the Enhancement Shaman's own buff. Still though, it was an extremely important totem for any melee group as it was a huge DPS increase. Seriously, no hardcore raiding guild went without having an Enhancement Shaman in their melee group. That totem was just too important to skip. So how was their damage output? Now that they have dual wield, they should be able to do much more reliable DPS and get a chance to be on top of the damage meters, right? I mean, they have double the Wind Fury now. Well, unfortunately, in the raiding scene, Enhancement Shamans were barely seen at the top. They always bit the dust against those warlocks and mages, and even in lower level dungeons, their elemental brothers were trouncing them on the damage meters. I've played a Shaman for a long time on the Phoenix server, and I geared myself up to have a full set of elemental gear and a full set of enhancement gear. I tried them both, and even before jumping into Karazhan, I was able to pull 1000 DPS in my elemental spec. When I switched over to enhancement, I was struggling way more to do solid DPS with an average of 600 to 800. Still decent, but nowhere near enough to ever get to the top of the damage meters. However, like their elemental brothers, Enhancement Shamans should never be seen as pure damage dealers. Their first and most important thing is the buffs they bring to the raid. Yes, they might not keep up with a Shadow Destroy Warlock, yes, they might not keep up with a Fire Mage, but neither of those provide other classes with such a huge damage boost. Neither of those have such an extent of extra raid buffs at their fingertips. This is where the Enhancement Shaman shined. Like I said, they were crucial to any melee group if you were raiding as a guild, and that was really the strong point of the Shaman class. Sure, that Fury Warrior might pull over 1000 DPS, but he's up there because of the totems the Shaman deployed. He's up there because the Shaman popped Bloodlust. So, all in all, the Burning Crusade was a great expansion for the Enhancement Shamans. They were finally able to do much more stable DPS, they were able to pull their own weight, and they were in high demand for all the amazing buffs they brought to the raid. And last but not least, we arrive at the Wrath of the Lich King era of the game. Here's the talent tree Shamans had to work with in this expansion. A few things I want to point out is that their top talent was Feral Spirit, which summoned 2 Ghost Wolves who fought by her side. That provided a nice DPS boost and, well, it looked badass. The other talent I want to talk about is Maelstrom Weapon, which is definitely one of the more interesting talents Shamans got in Wrath of the Lich King. This gave you a chance to reduce the cast time of your Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightning, Lesser Healing Wave, Chain Heal or Hex spell by 20%, and this stacked up to 5 times. That's right, 5 stacks and you would get an instant cast from one of those spells. This meant that Enhancement Shamans got a lot of flexibility, as they could use this to give them a little boost in terms of DPS, or they could throw out an instant heal to a tank when he's low health, or they could even insta-CC mobs if that's needed. So Shamans got a lot of goodies in the Wrath of the Lich King era, but what about their DPS? Were they still kinda in the middle and relying heavily on supporting the raid? Well, yeah. Once again, the Elemental Shamans were doing better in the early stage of the game, and in the later stage of the game, they were often found in the middle to lower bracket of the DPS. Don't get me wrong, they did do decent DPS and were able to pull their own weight, but it was never mind-blowing. Nevertheless, they shined when it came to providing buffs to the group, and in Wrath of the Lich King, Bloodlust was reworked where it now gave the entire raid 30% attack speed. That's right, it wasn't just the group the shaman was in that got bloodlust, it was now the entire raid, so that on its own was a good reason to have at least one shaman in your raid. To be fair though, Frost Death Knights and Hunters now provided similar buffs to the raid, so shamans weren't alone in the utility department. All in all, Enhancement Shamans have come a long way since 2004. They went from being a spec where with every melee hit you prayed for a Wind Fury proc, to a well-respected, stable DPS spec who provided some amazing buffs to the raid. Sure, they weren't perfect, but no class is without its flaws, and those flaws do not stand in the way of the fact that the Enhancement Shaman is heaps of fun. So I salute everyone who plays an Enhancement Shaman. May you have Wind Fury procs for days. And that's the end of this episode. As always, I want to thank you for watching this video. I'm Hamsterwheel, and have a good one.